My name is Jung-Hoon Lee. I'm a professor of international relations at Yonsei University here in Seoul, Korea. This session is titled Nuclear Weapon States versus Non-Nuclear Weapon States. Arguably the most open topic amongst many panels that we have in this conference. But the good news, of course, is that we have three excellent presenters to give various aspects on the nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states issues. Let me just introduce the panelists first before moving on to the topic matter. Immediate to my left is Dr. Ethel Solingen from UC Irvine. She's Chancellor's Professor at UC Irvine and President-elect of International Studies Association. She's also President of the APSA's International History and Political Section, and the Chair of the Steering Committee of the University of California's System-Wide Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. To her left is Mr. Henry Sokolski, who is the Executive Director at the NPEC, Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center. He currently serves as an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics in Washington and has been a resident at the National Institute for Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation and also the Hoover Institution. And finally, at the far left is Dr. James Walsh, who is a research associate at the MIT's Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Security Studies program. He was the executive director of the Managing the Atom Project at Harvard University and a visiting scholar at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. As I was saying, this is a very wide open topic. So, we have to really seek out to identify what the issues are that pits nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. And the one thing that, of course, comes to my mind is the reference to the 2010 NPT review conference, where a lot of these issues that pitted the nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states came out. I think if some of you who've attended the earlier morning session, the first session, there were some discussions on the necessity, but the resistance as well, of the NPT-recognized nuclear weapon states to go down, to bring the level of the nuclear weapon stockpile to the level of, say, India or Pakistan, France, and what have you. So maybe that's one of the things that we could be talking about. But that's of course, in keeping with President Obama's nuclear zero, the nuclear free world that he's talked about, and perhaps as related to that, the New START treaty that's been underway certainly is a very good first step, contributing step towards this end. There are other issues, of course, that were discussed at the NPT Review Conference, like measures to advance the peaceful use of the nuclear energy, implementation of the 1995 Middle Eastern Resolution, creation of the nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. And then, of course, how do we go about identifying or making the distinction amongst the non-nuclear weapon states? Because when we say nuclear weapon states, we're basically just talking about NPT-recognized nuclear weapon states, and there's just 5 of them. And then there's, as I mentioned earlier, Pakistan, India, Israel, North Korea, Iran, so on. So hopefully, during the discussions, some distinctions could be made to identify or differentiate the non-nuclear weapon states in accordance with the NPT definition. So without further ado, let me give the mic over to Dr. Ethel Solingen.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. Happy to be here. I'd like to address two dimensions of the problem. First of all, the demand side. Most non-nuclear weapon states have little interest in nuclear weapons. So why do some non-nuclear weapon states seek nuclear weapons in violation of international commitments? And second, I'll briefly address the supply side, the supply of diplomacy, persuasion, and coercion. What can the international community do about non-nuclear weapon states that violate international commitments? If we don't know what the chief driver on the demand side is, we would be employing inefficient means on the supply side. So at the outset, I'd like to point out that nuclear weapon states must make major moves in the direction of denuclearization. And some progress is evident, but much more remains to be done. But the reason for to make progress on nuclear arsenals is that they provide a justification, not a reason, but a justification, a pretext for others to violate their non-proliferation commitments. I have never been convinced that what the official 5 nuclear weapon states do or don't do constitutes the main driver for the demand for nuclear weapons. For instance, by Iran, Syria, North Korea, possibly Burma, etc., cases you're all familiar with. So let me address the demand side. On the demand side, I've argued that the domestic political economy models that leaders embrace to stay in power or survive in power, including their orientations to the global economy, have implications for nuclear choices. I have no time to elaborate on the argument, but very briefly, internationalizing states that seek favorable integration into the global economy are less likely to embrace nuclear weapons, and vice versa. Nuclear weapons are particularly appealing to a brand of inward-looking regimes that resist integration into the global economy or are suspicious of international markets, institutions, investments, etc. North Korea being the quintessential example, emphasizing the ideology of chuche or autarky. So nuclear weapons here, in cases of like North Korea, are conceived as tools of regime survival that enhance domestic support and a potential, to a far more limited extent, a potential deterrent against external threats. So there are multiple sources of nuclearization in the case of North Korea in particular, but in a fundamental way, these sources can all be traced to chuche as the guiding principle of an inward-looking political economy, which is sort of the favored model of regime survival. Why is this important? Why do I emphasize this point? Because in my view, there has been, and we tend to still be exposed to this vein of thinking, there's an over-concentration on, both in the policy and the academic community, I should say, on external threats or security, quote-unquote, imperatives as drivers of proliferation. The deceiving simplicity of blaming external threats for instance, North Korea's behavior results in a conflation of state security with regime security. And the two are not the same. I won't elaborate on this point, but I'll be happy to do so in the Q&As if asked, both on Iran and North Korea or any of the other cases I'm familiar with. But But the bottom line is, as Karim Sadjapur, for instance, puts it in the case of Iran, Iran's sense of siege is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The looming foreign enemy is needed to justify domestic suppression. So that's the demand side. What can be done? On the supply side, I build on, and by the way, the elaboration of both the argument and 9 cases for the demand side are in a flyer I left upstairs in a book I published entitled Nuclear Logics, the logics of the demand side. On the supply side, I build on a collaborative project to be published by Cambridge University Press. One of the participants in that project is in the audience. Looking into a variety of tools, sanctions, diplomacy, and positive inducements that have been deployed to counter the demand for nuclear weapons. So let me make a few points very briefly, telegraphically. First, it's important to highlight that there remain significant divisions among and within nuclear weapon states and among and within non-nuclear weapon states on these issues. So, for instance, China's compliance or deficient compliance with sanctions has been noted earlier today. It's selective and inconsistent implementation. Although from China's point of view, endorsing sanctions de jure is actually a big deal. It's an evolution from where China was decades earlier regarding sanctions. For all of its public vacillation on sanctions, both on Iran and North Korea, China's vast investments in Iran's gas and refining infrastructure appears to be mired in either actual difficulties or perhaps purposeful efforts to slow down any progress. But enforcing compliance with sanctions remains a challenge worldwide, not just with China. A 2010 United Nations report reveals that 111 of 192 members, UN members, had not submitted reports on their implementation with UN Security Council resolutions against North Korea. North Korea and Iran have been quite skillful in deepening cleavages among senders of sanctions and have gravitated toward trading partners that place the least amount of restrictions on their activities, primarily in the Middle East. Second point, both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states face the following dilemma. Autocratic, and I go back to the demand side here, autocratic inward-looking regimes like North Korea's account for most cases of non-compliance with international commitments in the last 2 decades and before. Hence, these models have also been the most frequent targets of both sanctions and positive inducements. However, the very structure, composition, preferences, and strategies of inward-looking regimes also makes them the most resistant or hardened against external inducements, particularly negative but also positive ones. So the irony is that the most frequent targets of external influence are also expected to be the least vulnerable to them or the most indifferent to both sanctions and positive inducements. Number 3, there is what I've called the Goldilocks dilemma that both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states face in addressing this problem, and that is the fact that perceptions regarding the appropriate mix of persuasion and coercion differ. So for some, sanctions have been too strong, or for others, too little, too weak. For some, positive inducements have not been tried hard enough. For others, they've been too harsh, too timid. For others, they've been tried extensively, and so on and so forth. I have an elaboration of this point, but I'll leave it maybe for Q's and A's. A fourth telegraphic point, another dilemma that both nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapon states face is how to deal with the fact, and this is a very timely context to highlight this point, how to deal with the fact that violators of non-proliferation commitments, such as North Korea, Syria, Iran, are also involved, Libya, in human rights violations, terrorism, narco-trafficking, money laundering, and other illicit behaviors, all of which raises the dilemma of whether one should link compliance in one issue area with other issue areas, or demand acquiescence with international expectations across the board on all issues, or a third option, create a hierarchy of issues that must be complied with in some sequential order. I mean, this is the Libya case brings that to the fore. 5 international political dynamics, I believe, internal political dynamics, I believe, are the main driver of nuclear aspirations, but a deteriorating external environment strengthens the so-called military first, or in this part of the world, the Songun, inward-looking model in North Korea, shifting it away from both economic reform and the fulfillment of denuclearization promises. So external threats, whether or not they're credible, I believe they're not credible. I even found evidence for earlier periods where they weren't credible. But any external threat is easy fodder for a regime to rally forces around the flag. And from this point of view, threats to either North Korea, Iran, or others are counterproductive. And instead, the extension of negative security guarantees, as in the 2005 joint statement, for instance, deflates the regime's ability to manipulate external threats or presumed external threats for its own purposes. I have 2 quick points, and I'll stop there. 6, the bottom line is how to turn an inward-looking regime into an internationalizing one, the $64,000 question. China-style economic reforms encouraged by the international community are probably the golden bullet, but not one that Kim Jong-il, for instance, has been willing to bite, presumably because he thinks such reforms have the potential to hasten his own demise. But the absence of reform could well become an even greater danger to his regime than reform itself. He is between the rock and a hard place. And I think Kim Jong-il is probably studying the Middle East very carefully, as is, by the way, Khamenei and colleagues in Iran. And 7, even whether it is unclear whether or not they work, imposing sanctions is an inevitable part of maintaining the non-proliferation regime's credibility in the face of persistent violations. Sanctions are often regarded as less damning than no action. Sanctions may not, and sanctions may not be a perfect tool, but I think one should be aware, or one should beware of making the perfect the enemy of the good. As a very well-known scholar of economic statecraft, David Baldwin, argued, sanctions may be the most appropriate policy relative to its alternatives in a given situation, even if they don't yield the desired outcome. At the end of the day, few scholars and practitioners I know advocate sanctions as the silver bullet for achieving denuclearization, but they are one component in diverse packages that may also include positive inducements. And finally, I'll end with this. One should not forget that sanctions did work in Libya and Iraq. 2 of 4, a 50% rate of success maybe, 2 of the 4 cases or more prominent cases in the last couple of decades. So despite skepticism regarding the ability to overcome coordination problems, some believe that at long last, the cumulative sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council and others have also started to work their serious effects on Iran's economy. Others, however, noted and continue to note that unlike the cases of Iraq and Libya, Iran's oil exports were not under sanctions, and at least in part of fear that they would undermine the feeble global economic recovery. So this has led some to label economic sanctions on Iran as weak tea, dismissing their impact. In any event, I think I'll stop there and move on before we take questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Solingen. I guess to simplify your very insightful presentation, it's the bad guys who get attracted to this weapon, and it's the same guys, same bad guys who are the least likely to be vulnerable to sanctions and various measures to give them up. I think a lot of food for thought and questions after the presentations. I will now turn to Dr. Henry Sokolski.
I'm not a doctor.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I got a higher degree. It's called ABD. It takes a lot longer. It's all but dissertation. I left on my own. Actually, that kind of raises a disclaimer of sorts. I have some academic background, but I come to this topic through the lowly experience of government service. And I spent 13 years in the government of the United States in the executive and legislative branch. I think because of that service, when I finally left, I was a political appointee, so I didn't have much choice. We lost. It's a great way to go. You don't have to explain yourself. You just get thrown out. I determined that I had some spare time and some spare cash. I did something which was very useful. I decided to actually sit down and read 10 years of negotiating history of the NPT. And I've come to this topic after having dragged myself through all of that. It's quite interesting history. It's available. It can be read. Essentially, we have a cosmic topic here. About the only thing not included is talking about aliens. I mean, everybody is covered, weapons and non-weapon states. But I think if you look and reflect upon history, you can come to this topic making, I think, the following key points, and I'll try. One is that it's the benefits that non-weapon states do or do not have, and the disarmament responsibilities nuclear weapon states do or do not have, that pretty much has defined the debate of what the non-proliferation regime's prospects are and what the NPT might mean. And so I kind of think those questions, I'm going to say they're central. I think that the next point is that although we've debated what the answers to those questions might be for, I guess, 40 years, the answer that we currently have, which is quite popular, I don't think is very optimal. In fact, taken to its logical extreme, I would argue the answers that we have now, and I'll go through those in a moment, can actually make things worse with regard to preventing the spread of nuclear weapons capabilities to new states or restricting the accumulation of nuclear weapons in states that have them. Okay, I'll talk about that, and then I think I'd like to go back and say that the current view, besides being less than optimal, actually historically doesn't really jibe with the original justification for the negotiation of an NPT, or a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and that's worth noting. I'll then close out with the observation that it's history, can't go back, and so maybe we need to think about how we can bring things back into kilter without just being reactionary, and I'll have some suggestions. So that's roughly what I'm going to do, okay? Now, I've already explained that I think thinking about the benefits for non-weapon states and the disarmament responsibilities of nuclear weapon states define the debate or dispute between non-weapons and weapon states writ large. The current view, I think, is not optimal. What is this current view? And that is, first, the weapon states must do a lot more, in particular the superpowers must do much more and work much harder to rid themselves of their nuclear arms, or at least try. The other view that's popular that answers these questions dictates or stipulates that non-weapon states have a per se right to any form of nuclear energy technology so long as it's declared, claimed to be peaceful and has some conceivable civilian application, and is occasionally visited by international inspectors. Now, the difficulty with these views, which are extremely popular, by the way, I think every government subscribes to this set of views, which ought to be enough to make you leery right there, unless, I don't know, you're just incredibly trusting. Everyone subscribes to this, but if these views are taken to their logical conclusion and pushed, and boy, do we do it, you get two very weird side effects. One, and I think it's been touched upon in previous presentation, is that if you push the argument that the superpowers really have to do much, much, much more, it kind of takes states who have arsenals that are expanding a little bit off the hook. It allows them to deflect criticism by saying, well, we'd like to disarm, but the superpowers need to do more first. And you hear this. I mean, if you get into it, you can read what Pakistanis and Indians say and others. The second problem with this popular set of views is, of course, also been discussed before in your presentation, and that is that it kind of becomes a exploited perspective that if you have this per se right, well, you can go right up to the brink of acquiring bombs or beyond it. And certainly North Korea can be interpreted to have played that game. People argue Iran is. We can keep going on that, but it's a problem. Now, what I think is interesting about this set of popular views is not just that, taken in the extreme, they're suboptimal for non-proliferation or arms control, but I do think they're actually at odds with the original justification and rationale for negotiating an NPT. People don't like reading history. I don't know why. It's very helpful. Frank Aiken is a name that deserves to be there needs to be a room called the Frank Aiken Room, or at least a monument somewhere. He was the Irish foreign minister who first suggested in 1958 at the UN that there be a treaty on nuclear nonproliferation. Read his arguments, and boy, are they different than what this popular current view is of what the benefits and obligations are. I think it's interesting to look at that and think about how right or wrong they might be today. First, real interesting, he argued that the value in stemming the further spread of nuclear weapons capabilities in new states was actually greater for non-weapon states than for weapon states. You don't hear that anymore. What he was driving at is, and he's probably wrong about this, but he asserted it, that weapon states, which was basically Russia and the United States and Great Britain at the time, had somehow figured out how to spook each other into not using these weapons. Delicate balance, sturdy balance, whatever, of terror, yeah? That they had figured out maybe how to deter one another. I don't know how sound that is, but that's what he asserted. And that therefore the real danger was seeing these weapons spread, and that if they did, every small nation would feel threatened in a way that they wouldn't be so threatened by the superpowers having these things, and there might be use. He also argued that it was absolutely prerequisite to any practical disarmament of the superpowers to first make sure that everyone was confident that the weapons wouldn't spread to more nations. And the reason why, actually, I think, was very sound, and perhaps we're experiencing it in a way today. He said, the more people you get in a room, the less likely you are to get agreement. So if you want to negotiate a disarmament agreement, you don't want so many nations. I think he had an insight there, right? You're smiling. He thinks it's right. Finally, he very much was of the view, and argued it publicly, that nuclear power was awfully close to bomb making and was a problem. And he talked about reactors producing bomb-usable material, quite candid about that in a way that when you read the NPT Review Conference report of 2010, you barely get a hint of. I mean, that thing is really a problem if you look at it carefully. But again, nobody reads. That section on peaceful nuclear energy would have you believe there's nothing else but peaceful nuclear energy, and there's no alternative. So he finally argued that non-weapon states there should welcome the most intrusive inspections. They actually should be eager for this. Why? Well, to protect themselves from their neighbors that might get the bomb if they didn't have intrusive inspection, and more important, to be a testbed for disarmament. Now, this is history, and you can't go back. But I think it's useful to think about this alternative view of the NPT, because you could interpret it through this lens if you wanted to. And I think one of the really egregious errors of the NPT Review Conference is it has, I think, a sentence that says, you can't reinterpret the NPT. Well, good luck. I mean, you can assert that, but most of us who have read the NPT, which is only, how many pages? I don't know, 5 or 6 pages. It has an article that you know has been reinterpreted. Article 5. That article promises sharing the possible benefits of peaceful nuclear explosives. Holy cow, what's that? Well, they thought in the old days that you could use nuclear explosives to make canals and do mining and all sorts of things. They came to discover, though, the benefits didn't really exist. It cost more money to clean up after you exploded one of these things than any benefit of clearing the land you got from using it. And they also discovered that although nobody asked to have this service supplied, because there were no benefits, people did peaceful nuclear explosives, the Indians and the Russians, except they were nuclear tests. And people were not keen on nuclear tests. So he said, look, this is too close to exactly what we want to prevent, and there are no benefits. Game over. If you actually look at the review conference document on this, it's very good. It says you should review the latest UN resolution on the comprehensive test ban to understand the meaning of Article 5, i.e. it's dead letter. So this thing's been reinterpreted. I think it could be reinterpreted again. In specific, if you take a look at Article 4 and its guarantee of the inalienable right to peaceful nuclear energy, and you look at the preamble, it talks about the benefits of peaceful nuclear energy. It seems to me they're talking about two rebuttable propositions in some cases. What if what you're talking about, like a peaceful nuclear explosive, is right on the brink of being bomb fuel making, and you really cannot safeguard it in a timely fashion, reliably, from being diverted into being a bomb? By the way, there are a lot of people who argue that's the case with bulk handling facilities, have for years. Well, then maybe it's not peaceful. Because it turns out peaceful nuclear energy, the inalienable right under Article 4, says it's conditioned on it being in compliance with Articles 1 and 2, and that's been interpreted to mean 1, 2, and 3. And 1, 2, and 3 says direct or indirect transfers of anything that might be useful to make bombs not allowed, and it has to be capable of being safeguarded. And the safeguard's defined as something that prevents a diversion. This is all a long, exaggerated way of saying, strictly speaking, you could reinterpret Article 4. Now, I'm not crazy enough to think you can do this by just making the argument. I don't think you'll get anywhere with that. When you start talking about people's rights, it's lost cause. I mean, it's diplomatically, no one in the service of diplomacy wants to talk about people's rights and the way to interpret them. However, I think two things would help to get people to rethink the NPT and these benefits and disarmament obligations if several things were done, and I'm going to lay them out right now, and I'm going to close out. First, I think it would be helpful if people actually tried to quantify what various forms of civilian nuclear energy, whether it's isotopes or power or fuel making, what they cost. Now, this is a dirty secret. You're not supposed to compare costs. We don't do a very good job of it in the United States, and everyone else does an even worse job. Maybe that's a mistake, because if you can convince people it's really expensive and not that beneficial, you would do less of it. I can tell you one thing. If you make isotopes, you make money. Lots of it. You can sell them. You can make them for less than you can sell them for. Not so clear in the case of, let's say, the subject of the previous panel, reprocessing. Not such a good trade-off for investment. I could go further, but it would be useful to compare costs. You would do that, I think, by agreeing to common accounting procedures for costing out energy projects. Maybe at the G20, there's an institution called ARENA at the UN. Might do it there. You could do it nationally. In any case, that would be helpful. You might also get someone who could cost out what subsidies are worth in each case, not only for nuclear but non-nuclear things, because that's a big cost and pricing problem for energy. It also would help if you could have some evaluations, either with or without the IAEA's help, in determining what they can and cannot safeguard by their own lights. They have criteria with numbers about what the timely detection requires in the way of visitation and detection of certain materials and certain amounts. First, you want to ask, are they meeting their own criteria? By the way, the short answer is, in some areas, absolutely not. Then the second question you want to ask is, well, is the criteria tough enough? I have an opinion. I think absolutely not is the answer as well. But people should debate this. I think if you did both of those things, you might get back to a sounder view of what peaceful nuclear energy might be, and what's beneficial, and what's safeguardable. Second, and last of all, with regard to Article 6 and disarmament, there's quite a lot of unanimity about how we need to get the superpowers to do more to reduce their nuclear weapons. I guess I'm not against that, and we're sort of doing it. It's not to everyone's liking, the rate. But I think it's probably wrong to put as much emphasis as we do on it, because I'm pretty sure it's at least as important to put the spotlight on what's going on between countries like India and Pakistan, who are building up, after all, and all the hedging activity in the Middle East. I mean, Turkey wants 20 reactors, Saudi Arabia wants 16. Give me a break. We know what that's about. And what's going on, even in this region, needs to be spoken about more candidly. A lot of hedging going on. I think if we did this, I think we would be better off in achieving these goals, and that the differences in the yelling and screaming between nuclear and non-nuclear states would be a little bit more muted and civil. Anyway, that's my piece. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sokolski. We're actually kind of running out of time. We have 30 minutes now, so I'll go directly to Dr. James Walsh.
We're running out of time, and I'm the last speaker. But I talk really fast.
So we want to leave some time for...
Yeah, no, I'm kidding. And I talk fast, so it's not going to be a problem. First of all, let me begin. Even with limited time, I have to thank the Asan Institute for hosting this spectacular conference. It's lavish and spectacular, and it's great to be here and see so many colleagues and meet new friends. And it's a privilege to be on this panel with these distinguished scholars. I want to focus on this panel, this discussion of nuclear weapon states versus non-nuclear weapon states, on what I think is the key word, which is versus. And I want to talk about the political stalemate we're in, why we have that stalemate, and how we might be able to get around it, although, I wouldn't hold out great hope for that. But I think it's important to step back and look at it. Obviously, as the opening panel mentioned today, we have the established three pillars of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Those are disarmament, non-proliferation, and access to peaceful uses, civilian nuclear energy or other applications. And I think when you look back, and I think Henry's right to want to look back at the history of the NPT, and the NPT is critical in this regard. It establishes these three pillars. But when you look at the NPT, you're reminded of two important things. One, these issues are inherently international. They are not going to be resolved bilaterally or with a small clump of nations, although I agree it's easier to negotiate some of these things originally with a small clump of nations. But they are inherently international, and they are inherently political. Now, we tend to talk about non-proliferation and disarmament and these other issues as if they're technical or they're driven by security. I agree with Attell that fundamentally nuclear issues, despite their security component, despite their technical component, are essentially political issues. And so when we look at this, the NPT, we see that there was a political agreement in which all sides were thought to benefit. In fact, if you look at the NPT, it came at a time when people had very high expectations about what nuclear energy would provide. Energy too cheap to meter and all the rest. And people had high expectations about it. The non-nuclear weapon states didn't want to get left out of the game, and so they were willing to make sacrifices in order to accrue other benefits. And so you had a political deal. You give up something, I give up something, and we all come out ahead. And so if we're going to move forward, we have to figure out what the nature of the political deal is going forward, in which I give up something and you give up something and we all come out ahead. And that's the fundamental crux of the problem, and that's why we have problems today. Because I think right now, if you look at where we are today, what you see is stalemate. You see that the Conference on Disarmament is deadlocked, primarily because of Pakistan, over the FMCT. You see that the Comprehensive Test Ban is sort of languishing. The NPT review conferences, 2010 notwithstanding, are basically, situations in which the non-nuclear weapon states vent their frustrations and anger at the nuclear weapon states and vice versa. Now, some of these are heartfelt. Others are political, again, that word, in the sense that they're really tactics used to try to achieve other goals, or they have to do with other political agendas. But the result is the same. That is that there is a gulf between the non-nuclear weapon states who feel aggrieved and the nuclear weapon states who feel that the non-nuclear weapon states are not doing enough. Now, I think Obama, because he was a fresh face, because he made a rhetorical commitment to a world without nuclear weapons, and because he made certain concessions at the NPT review process in 2010, was able to avoid the failure of 2005. But when we come back in 2015, he's not going to be that fresh face, and the bloom will be off the rose, and we'll be back to sort of hardcore political arguments that are going to make progress difficult, I think. And it's not just the United States here. I think the nuclear weapon states, it's going to be hard to move China, and it's going to be hard to move France and other nuclear weapon states to make as much action on reductions as the U.S. and the Soviets had. The U.S. and the Russians have, even with the modesty of the START process. So I look ahead and I see more likely continued stalemate than fresh breakthroughs and rapid advancement. And I think there are two contemporary problems that we have to face up to. One is, and it's alluded to by Henry, which is the problem of loopholes. What do you do about access to the fuel cycle, to reprocessing and enrichment? How are we going to get our hands around that issue? And secondly, ironically, in light of events this year, a sort of loss of leverage because suddenly questions about the safety of nuclear energy. Now, there had been a lot of talk prior to Fukushima about the nuclear renaissance. And so you had sort of, once again, after decades of a lull, a sense that, well, maybe this nuclear technology stuff is going to take off, and I don't want to be left out of the game, and so maybe there will be benefits to be derived if I'm a good player and a part of the system. Well, now it's not so clear, first of all, whether all countries will be equally interested in this, and secondly, whether we are interested in providing them with nuclear energy. Remember, with North Korea, the original agreed framework was going to provide North Korea with a civilian nuclear reactor. That was part of the deal. That was part of the benefits they were going to get. There's no interest in that anymore. And that is sort of just, I use that as a nugget or an example of the fact that people are not going to be so anxious about providing power plants to some countries, to Iran having lots of power plants or North Korea having lots of civilian power plants as part of a quid pro quo that might lead to some resolution of those nuclear disputes. So the fact that nuclear energy is having problems right now sort of weakens our ability to bring benefits to all parties and to advance the agenda. So what should we do about it? Well, I think there are different ways to refurbish the deal, and this sort of picks up on one of Henry's lines. I think we can add to it. It's always been nuclear for nuclear. You get nuclear power, and then you make compromises on nuclear weapons and safeguards. Well, I don't see why it has to be nuclear. I don't see why it can't be energy or cash or some other technology? Why can't we think creatively about what the nature of the benefits are that states accrue because they get to participate? I think, and Henry refers to it's one of my favorite examples. We can have political arrangements without having to try to change the text of the treaty. And we've done that with peaceful nuclear explosives. Everyone agrees that that's a bad idea. We may be able to agree that having enrichment and reprocessing spread to all who want it is a bad idea without having to write down words that make it illegal, but that we come to some political understanding in which those who participate in that arrangement accrue benefits, that they get something out of it too. So I think part of our focus should be on refurbishing and advancing the deal. The second may be to reframe it. I mean, partly we're caught in a political fight in which the sides are settled and which it's very little room to maneuver. So how do you get around that? You redefine the debate. And maybe what's happening now in terms of nuclear security is one way to do that. Everyone agrees that terrorists shouldn't have nuclear weapons. So, and that everyone agrees that nuclear power plants should be safe. So maybe in the pursuit of those goals and framing what we do internationally in the pursuit of those goals, that will allow us to do some things that, as a byproduct, strengthen the non-proliferation system or have implications for disarmament. So, if you have a roadblock, you walk around the boulder. And if you have a political fight that is set in stone, then you redefine the terms of the debate so that people can make commitments and you get the same thing anyway. So I would think about refurbishing. I would think about redefining the debate in terms of security, safety, internationalization, even climate change. Why can't we have an energy agreement that buried down in it has new understandings about how we handle nuclear energy going forward that, oh, by the way, advance the non-proliferation regime? So that's one way to get around, I think, in theory, the political deadlock we're currently in. And then finally, I think we need even in the face of gridlock and deadlock, we can continue to build the institutions. This morning, someone asked the question, well, what do we do going forward? And, if you were sitting in 1957 at the dawn of the International Atomic Energy Agency and you were saying, well, we need to have rules that will allow inspection teams to wander over a country, to take air samples, take swabs, they would have said, are you kidding me? There's no way anyone's going to agree to that, right? And they wouldn't have agreed to it. But instead what they did was built an institution that over time acquired expertise, mandates, capacities that allow today the things that happen that would never have been conceivable 30 years ago. So I think how do you get there? Part of how you get from here to there is you build institutional capacity, expertise, technologies, rules of the road, technical understandings, bureaucratic understandings that allow you to get to some point you want to be in the future, even if you can't get absolute political agreement on what that is today. So with those three suggestions, I'll stop.
Okay, thank you very much. We have about 20 minutes to take questions. So if you have questions or some quick comments to make, please raise your hand and identify yourself first, and then maybe if you can identify also who that question is being forwarded to, please.
Thank you. Chaim Braun from Stanford University. Questions to Henry. Given current realities, how would you interpret Article 4?
I'm sorry, given what?
Current realities.
Current reality.
All right. How would you interpret Article 4 inalienable rights in terms of economics and non-proliferation, seeing where we are right now?
I always say, if you've got something that people are going to really spit at you at, shut up. I would not talk about it. Now, I suggested this to our State Department. I said, look, I'm not asking you to say they don't have a right. Just stop saying they do. By the way, not talking is always an option with regard to suggestions about rights. So first thing I would do is tone down this argument about how it's absolutely a per se right and everything's clear. The fact of the matter is you say, well, all of this is controversial and it gets people upset. And I think if you say that, that's a start. The second thing I would do is be fair. Look, if nuclear power ever or is, depending on what your data is, if it really is as cheap and quick a way to get rid of carbon as NEI and every one of their supporters says, then you know what? I don't care if it blows the world up. We're going to buy endless amounts of it. It's like pornography and drugs. It doesn't matter that it hurts you. If it's available and cheap, human nature is to buy it. However, I do not see why and how something with these kinds of security premiums should be paid extra for. So I think what you do is first say the rights argument is controversial. It's not clear that it's a per se right, but we don't want to, try to disprove people's insistence that they do or don't have it. But it should be noted as controversial. Second, you start comparing costs. Now, initially, everybody who's in favor of nuclear power or some dangerous form of it will say, oh, it's very economical. But I think the more you engage in the question of what things cost, the better the numbers get. And my hunch is, if I'm right, those numbers are, for a lot of things that I think are dangerous, are really not going to be economical for a while. Now, that can change. Technology can change it. Enrichment's a perfect example where it might get really cheap. Silex. So you got a problem. But you work with what you got. I think, finally, if you start being more candid about what's safeguardable, I think that also helps. And I think Jim is absolutely correct. The Fukushima event puts another layer of concern that increases, I think, costs and raises the whole security specter of both mismanagement and possible sabotage that has to be thought through. All of this, I think, buys you more time and gets people to rethink how they should look at this right to peaceful nuclear energy. And what's peaceful, beneficial nuclear energy will change on you, much like this concern about the possible benefits of peaceful nuclear explosives. Finally, I think Jim is right about another thing that relates to your question, and that is you do want to start moving forward on forms of non-nuclear energy assistance. Actually, by U.S. law, we're supposed to do this under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act. We've never really implemented that portion of the law. So there's stuff to work with already, and we're not doing it. We ought to.
Okay, other? Please.
Thank you. This is a terrific panel for several reasons. One, it has a sense of history. And on Henry's point, if we go back and look at the history of predictions about nuclear non-proliferation, John F. Kennedy, Alistair Buchan, Leonard Beaton, people 30, 40 years ago, they were all wrong. They predicted a much faster rate of proliferation. The United States government was convinced that Germany was going to build nuclear weapons, therefore had a program called Crazy Program Multilateral Nuclear Fleet. We know that Germany did not build nuclear weapons, neither did Japan. Now, here's my unfair question. We're in this wonderful hotel, as Jim mentioned. We're going to go to sleep tonight. We're going to sleep well for 20 years, okay? And by that time, this is the 10th Asan Plenum. And you wake up and you kind of wonder, how many nuclear powers are there? That's the question I'd like to ask, if I may. It's an unfair question, I know. Each of the journalists, each of the panelists, what is your expectation regarding proliferation over the course of the next 15, 20 years? And if you're brave enough to do so, give us the 3 countries that you think are most likely to proliferate.
You want to take that, Asan?
Okay. You remind me of a question I was asked a few years ago. As I was writing that book we discussed earlier on, I had this model that I tried to convey today about who does it and why. And the question was, well, if you're right, give us the next 3, right? And I'm really not in the business of predicting, but I said, at least I have certain conditions, right, that if they're fulfilled, they will prove the argument, they will provide some validation for the argument. And if they're not fulfilled, then, they will rebut the argument. So this was about 6-7 years ago. So I did name couple countries, and they were Venezuela and Burma. I knew nothing empirically about what was going on there, and I don't think they were even under the radar of at the time. They are now. But in terms of the profile, the inward looking, et cetera, they fit very well. A few months after that talk, Venezuela was found shopping around, and there isn't really a program in there right now that I know of. I've just written about Venezuela. But nonetheless, I could tell you, given certain conditions, right, these are the candidates. So if I were to wake up 20 years from now, I don't know who it would be, but I can give you the profile. But I also can tell you that the conditions of the global political economy at the time will have much to do with who does what, right? Under the conditions of a thriving, sort of internationalizing global economy, even with the hiccups that we're witnessing today, there will be much less incentives and perhaps much fewer cases that would be prone to do that. In a world of 1930s, like, big are thy neighbor, inward-looking sort of global economy, you might well see many more.
So I'll take that. I'll take that question because I think it's a fun question, and it sort of also tells you a little bit, working back from it, what your core assumptions are. And I think I'll take a position that few will take, which is I think we'll have fewer and fewer nuclear weapon states. And it's not just that the predictions didn't come true, the rate has been going down. And so I actually think, I can imagine circumstances in which North Korea does give up its nuclear weapons, or it is, they have one in a cave somewhere, but functionally it's meaningless, right? Because they're on some path, or maybe there's a collapse and there's a change in government. I can imagine scenarios in which either they don't have them because there's big dramatic change, or they have a device somewhere, but it's sort of discovered hundreds of years later because it's been forgotten about. I think it's not inevitable that Iran becomes a nuclear weapon state at all. Maybe Pakistan will collapse and something will happen there. But if the ones who are going to give it up sooner rather than later, I think France, and despite strong French nationalism, I think France and Britain seem to be good candidates. It's going to be tough. Israel's going to be awfully tough. But I think we'll have fewer rather than more. I do not believe the stuff about a second wave of nuclear weapon states. I just don't buy it.
Now for a slightly different view. First of all,
I'm glad this is being taped.
Yeah.
I also want to say that I've never been in, for all the nuclear panels I've been in, I've never heard anyone compare nuclear weapons or nuclear power to pornography and what was the other one?
Drugs.
Drugs and pornography.
Big demand. Awesome. Also, probably, jewelry and watches. I mean, if they're low enough, there's an endless demand for them. First, a proper attention to our own profession dictates that we be much more pious about the church of doom and gloom. You cannot be in this business and be totally optimistic. There's no point to it. On the other hand, if you think there's a problem, then you have to work it. So if you wish the problem away, you're in the wrong field. You need to have at least as much pessimism as optimism. Okay? Or you're not.
I can do lots of things.
Yeah. Well, how shall I put it? I'm here to be sure that we have a 50-50 break on this. With regard to JFK, I think you got the history wrong there. If you read carefully, he didn't say it was inevitable. And I got to tell you, the latest research that I've done for the Defense Department by commissioning research, and it's available, is by a fellow who works at Brookhaven. His name is Thomas Graham. I recommend it. It's on a website for my institution. And it pretty much paints why and how you could get easily to 20 now. Okay, so who are they? Who the heck knows? But let's get proper nouns in here. I like, if I was in the futures market for weapons capabilities, I would focus on Turkey, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, and South Korea. And it seems to me that if any one of those goes, I really do think there'd be a really bullish market for this stuff. And the idea that somehow we don't have as much to worry about strikes me as possible, but something that will take tremendous effort. I think that's why we're here.
Are there any Saudi Arabian or South Korean in the audience who might second this prediction? Did you have a question?
We still have time?
Yeah, we do. We have about 10 minutes. I think we have maybe 2-3 more questions.
And by the way, I completely disagree on South Korea.
Like I say, we're here.
Cutting into your rebuttal or continuation?
More questions is better.
Okay. I'm Jonathan George from Lawrence Livermore National Lab in the States. And it's always intriguing when the haves discuss the attitudes of the have-nots. So could the panel talk for a few moments about, in the mind of those entities that might want to acquire nuclear weapons, what is bad?
What is what?
What would be bad in their mind for acquiring nuclear weapons? And if you can, divorce your answer from all the reasons that countries that don't have nuclear weapons, the reasons why they chose not to have it. Just try to concentrate on, in the mind of potential acquirers, what would be the disadvantage to them of acquiring nuclear weapons?
Do you have any panelists?
I like all three.
So, yeah, that's a diplomatic answer. So I'm going to hop on this real quick. You know, I think this is one of those situations where I think it's misleading to talk about the state as a unitary actor. This is my own view. I think these are decisions, sometimes the state, Kim Jong-il is probably a unitary actor. But even that in a military-first policy, when you're dying, maybe that's a little more up for grabs than it used to be. But in any case, for most states, the decisions are a result of a bureaucratic process, of institutions. And institutions have interests. And nuclear weapons represent either a win or a loss for institutions. And it depends on the context. And looking back, some states, their nuclear institution, the equivalent of the AEC, they would see nuclear weapons as a winner because they were starving on the vine. They weren't getting any cash. The program wasn't going anywhere. And the nuclear weapons program was a way to win the attention of the sovereign and to begin to build themselves up again. In militaries, traditionally it's been air forces that have been big proponents because they get planes. And armies have been a little less excited about it. So I think it'll depend on the political frame and sort of who's sitting at the table and whether the nuclear weapon is seen as a benefit or a loss for the institutional interests of the people who are making that decision.
Yeah, I'd like to second that point that there aren't any monolithic actors. I actually made this point very early on in the conversation on why some states want it and others don't, in a 1994 article. And I think there is definitely a division in many of these countries between those that favor it and those that don't. And that there's a dynamic in there, an internal dynamic that brings to the fore, one faction over the other. It is true, for instance, that in this country, in South Korea, in the 1970s, there was a tug of war, or tug of war is too strong, but there was a competition between what I would call the inward-looking forces of deepening industrialization and a more inward-looking vein, and those that favored, under Park Chung-hee, an internationalized economy. So in every country you have this in mostly every country you have, and I would argue even in North Korea, no dictator can stay in power alone. There is always a supportive coalition that helps him or her maintain themselves in power. But so who prevails in this sort of competition, right? Very much will tell you what is in their minds, what are in their minds the opportunity costs. So, for instance, under Khatami, it was very clear what the opportunity costs aware of pursuing a nuclear program. He wasn't in total control of it, of course, because he was only president, and Khamenei was the one dictating the terms. But to Khatami and his people, there was a very clear-cut sense of what the opportunity costs, which were precluding Iran from joining, coming in from the cold, and so on and so forth. I imagine even in North Korea, there are not factions, that would be too much, but elements in export processing zones and so on that understand the opportunity costs. There were so in Argentina, Brazil, many of these countries. We were just having a conversation with Mr. Pierre here that we're considering at some point. I would even go as far as saying Switzerland, at some point, as you know, was a candidate. I once, very briefly, I remember asking a group of Swiss experts out of the blue at a conference like this, very late, after a very nice dinner and a lot of wine. So why did Switzerland not pursue nuclear weapons? It was deadly silence initially, and at the end of that silence, one of them told me, well, the banks would have not liked it. And there was nothing better to my ears, given the kind of argument I make, than that answer.
I think my take's a little briefer. First, I don't know. Probably end with that. Second, what little experience I've had in the Pentagon shutting down programs, it seems to be the successes, and we had about 3 or 4 of them, one or two I can't talk about even, had to do with fear and loathing about losing political control and a desire to get more of it. And if we showed them how they could get more control of their country and their military by shutting something down, they were really interested in that. But I'm not entirely sure. I've got a project where we're going to study how Pakistan, Russia, France, and China dealt with securing their nuclear arsenals during severe political crises. I think we'll learn something from these primary histories, I'm hoping. And I've tried to enlist people who were there at the time to do some of the writing. We'll see. But I think political control always is a concern, when you're going into these projects and whether you push through or pull back.
Okay, we'll take this as a final question. If you go ahead.
I think they waived the 5-minute sign out. So
thank you very much.
Have to be short.
I'd like to commend the panel for their very in-depth analysis. I'm the ambassador of Pakistan, Shaukat Muqaddam's name, in South Korea.
No offense from my earlier comments.
Pardon? I had just one comment and one question. Comment regarding your statement, if Pakistan collapses. Please be rest assured, Pakistan will not collapse. And the situation in which we are today, the challenges which we are facing, they are not our doing. And we are facing because of superpower rivalries. So, and when the elephants make love, the grass gets trampled. So, but we are in the very challenging phase of our country's history. But we are a very resilient nation and will come out of it. Now, regarding the question, the panel really highlighted very good ideas, and one of them was between weapon states and non-weapon states, and give and take. I think that was a wonderful idea which you proposed. Now, if there are, for example, but 2 states, and they are both, weapon states, but they are not signatory to the NPT, and if the weapon states, they give them the civilian nuclear deal, but not to the other neighbor. So don't you think it is discriminatory? So what's your comment on that? Because that sort of a proposal should be non-discriminatory.
If it makes you feel any better, I oppose the U.S.-India nuclear deal. Yeah, I thought it was a terrible idea. And by the way, I was just, I retract any implication I may have offered about the future stability of Pakistan. I love Pakistan.
Actually, I would argue 2 wrongs make 2 wrongs. I'm not so sure it's a great idea to encourage Pakistan to take what little money it has and pour it into this stuff. But certainly, it's very hard to argue if you do it for India, you shouldn't do it for Pakistan, and I'm sensitive to that. It seems to me the smarter way to go is to put pressure to persuade India to sort of not go very heavily into the civilian thing, and to try to figure out how to improve relations between the two countries so that neither feels the need to build up either with civilian or military nuclear activity.
So very quickly, pardon my consistency, but I do believe there are implications to whether or not countries have incentives to whether or not countries face this cleavage. And it is my view that Pakistan maybe is under the weight of this domestic competition, and in essence, the difference between India and Pakistan may well be, and some of the other countries, who is least likely to export this technology to other countries. And on that account, some countries have better reputation than others of not transferring sensitive technologies.
Okay, we're being pressured by the organizers to end the session. I think you'll all agree that the more we talk about anything to do with nuclear, the more uncertain things get, and there's no perfect happy ending. I think the session was no exception to that rule, but I think you will also agree that it was very stimulating and very interesting, so please join me in applauding and thanking the three panelists. Thank you.
That is the end of all the sessions scheduled for today. The opening dinner for the Asan Plenum will be held at the Lotte Hotel immediately following this. For those participants who have already registered for the dinner,
I'm not sure.